Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic, leaving the world. Dr. Howard Stein, great friend and mentor and social star of bolesblogs.com, as well as this particular delightfully human meme podcast, shared something with me a few weeks before he died that I would like to share with you once again in the here and the now. Howard said this to me: "David, this is not the world I wanted to leave for you." And when Howard said that to me, he was sad, perhaps more melancholy, really, but not defeated. Howard's life had been defined by World War II. He fought for the USA on the ground in Italy, and he found himself and his wife while overseas. And I wrote a bit about that, about Howard's life overseas, in my bolesblogs.com article, Leaping from the Continent. And that melancholia, that sadness that Howard Stein felt then, is even more important now, 70 years after World War II ended. Now, during World War II, Howard was fighting for something grander than himself. He was young, 18 or so, and idealistic and terrified. But Howard knew there was something worth dying for, something that needed saving. And that thing, that mission, that devotion, that object of his dedication, was the idea of the United States of America. Yes, Howard Stein was fighting for freedom and fighting against fascism. He hated Hitler. He hated the Germans. Howard spent the rest of his life after the war reconciling the America of his youth and the country that surrounded him as he aged into an old man. And Howard was, in his last years, enveloped by and obsessed with the idea that this world he knew was not the world he fought to save in 1946. Howard was disappointed that the America he knew in his dying days wasn't grander or better or more worthwhile when set against the fight he'd put up for our freedom, when he was doing his duty to God and country in faraway Italy as a terrified, idealistic teenager. And in my ongoing wondering about Howard, and in my thinking about the world he wanted to leave behind for the rest of us, I am alarmed to wonder what he would now think of this world, just 6 years after his death. And what would Howard make of the proliferation of guns and school shootings and children having to take active shooter drills during school hours instead of studying? And not too long ago, my school days were spent, growing up, doing fire drills and tornado drills, innocuous events in comparison. My father's generation spent their school days ducking and covering, hiding under their school desks in the event of a nuclear bomb event being dropped in the playground. But those tornado drills, fire drills, the ducking, the covering, they're all tame, fairy tale myths of nostalgic ideals, compared to facing live gunfire in a schoolroom. But these guns, these military assault rifles in school, would have horrified Howard, because he knew what a military round could do to flesh and bone and muscle. And I am again reminded of a recent conversation I had with a local store manager friend of mine, who shared with me how her 9-year-old daughter planned to deal with an active shooter in her classroom. This is what I tweeted about our conversation. A friend's 9-year-old daughter said active shooter drills at school made her decide this. If there's a shooter in her room, she will not hide. She will take the blood of her dead best friend, who has already been shot, and smear his blood on her face and body and pretend to be dead. Now, several people online responded with want and wonder to that tweet. One person from the UK wondered how the USA could abide this sort of unsacred killing of our children. And I replied online, thinking precisely of Howard Stein's quote that always rings in my head, "This is not the world I wanted to leave for you." And so I replied this on Twitter. That's it. This is the world we have left for her. These are the things a 9-year-old must think about and decide. She also told me she plans to tell her teacher to put a table in front of the doorway, because the Florida shooter shot through the door and walked into the room. My store manager friend also told me her daughter was scared for the trip they were soon to take to Florida to visit the Disney theme park there. And it seemed her daughter was worried her teddy bear would be mistaken for a bomb, because the daughter liked to open up her teddy bear to see what was inside. And she was worried the authorities at the airport would think she planted a bomb in her teddy bear to blow up the airplane. And her store manager mother reassured her that she would take the teddy bear and sew it up tight and right, and nobody would ever think there was a bomb in her teddy bear. So yes, my human meme friend, this is the world Howard Stein left for us, along with a million other people before him. It's a terrible world, a cold world, a world fraught with the lack of imagination and human confidence. We live in a world where a 9-year-old must spend time thinking about faking her death to thwart an active shooter in her schoolroom, and then blocking the door with tables to prevent their own assassination, and living in terror of being accused of bombing an airplane with a teddy bear. And perhaps in all this humiliation there might be a good thing. Howard Stein was able to leave it all behind when he died. But if you knew Howard, you knew he wanted to live. He'd take one terrible day alive than no day at all. And in the end, Howard wanted one final heart surgery that might give him 4 extra months of life in this world. And his cardiologist decided the night before the surgery to not do the surgery, because he told Howard, "You won't make it off the table." And Howard was crushed. He was angry. But his family was ecstatic. He was not having that last operation. And Howard was dumbfounded by the response of his family. He yelled at them. Howard loved to yell. Howard yelled at his family, saying, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say you didn't want me to have the surgery?" And their reply to him was a simple one, with a quiet point, and they did not yell back. They simply said, "Dad, it's your life, not ours." And Howard Stein later bitterly told me his surgeon gave him a death threat, a death sentence by refusing the surgery. And Howard now had a ticking time bomb in his chest that was his heart that would explode at any moment. Howard told me he went to bed terrified. Terrified he wouldn't wake up in the morning. And when he was lucky and did wake up, it took him 6 hours just to get out of bed and get ready for the day. And by that time, it was time to get ready for bed again. And his world continued to spin. And Howard Stein continued to awaken for another couple of months. And now as we close our wondering about the things we leave behind for others to share or destroy, I am reminded of another story Howard used to share in the same vein as leaving the world behind. But this story has a wholly different tone. One day Howard was on the New York City subway, and a pregnant woman entered his train car. Howard saw her and offered her his seat. And as she took his seat, she laughed at him and said, "Sucker." Yes, the woman Howard gave his seat to called him a sucker. And Howard was furious and hurt. And yes, the woman was really pregnant. She wasn't tricking anybody, putting up some kind of show. It just clearly wasn't in her world meme to ever give up her seat to anyone else for any reason, even if that person was pregnant and she was not. To her, in her mind, to give up something you already had in hand or had pressed against your butt belonged to you, and you'd never give it up. And if you gave it up willfully, well, then in her culture, in her training, in her education, in her teaching of others, in the world in which she spun, you were a sucker. And Howard Stein loved telling that sucker story because it proved how crass the world had become, where a good deed was punished with cynicism and cruelty, where the insult took the place of the thank you. That was the world that was left behind for Howard. And he hated it. And he always wanted to change it back to the way it was supposed to be. And what about now? Can you imagine Howard Stein living in a President Trump world? Well, Howard would have a whole different definition of cruelty and false facts, and he'd be appalled at the world that spun on around without him. And I'm also quite certain Howard Stein might even likely be thankful for missing out on all of this. Missing out on the horribleness and the hatred that has taken over our culture and the world and our country. And Dr. Howard Stein might just even be tempted for an instant to look over his shoulder on his way to the grave and say, without cynicism or conviction, "David, this is not the world I wanted to leave for you." And instead of sharing a ringing melancholia, he might just finish that moment yelling this with a smile and a shoe shine. "Sucker!" Thank you for listening. Be a Human Meme.